Okay, so I attended a training this last week, and I wanted to give you some of the insights or some of the information about the test that I got there that I did not know before because the test has changed. So for one thing, we did go over footnotes earlier in the year, but footnotes apparently will not be on the exam starting this year. So that's great. You don't have to worry about arguments made in footnotes or what the year denotes in a footnote. That's just not going to be on there. The other thing is that the writing questions this year are new. Um, and so while we don't really have access to a full exam yet, I think that they're going to give us one in March maybe, which is really close to the actual exam. My understanding is that they'll have two passages that are just reading questions. And those are the kinds of questions that we've been tackling in the passages that I've given you on the website. And then there'll be three passages that are just writing questions. And those are the ones we've seen a little bit more on the My AP unit ones, where they ask you about the proper transition or how to be concise or how to, cite the authority or something like that. So they're not going to intermix the questions, which is kind of nice because what that means is that you won't get confused about the argument based on poor writing that they're putting on into a passage. It might be the case that they have 3 reading passages and 2 writing passages. I'm not sure. I think they're supposed to be kind of an equal mix, but because there's 5 passages, one of those sets is going to get an extra passage. So that's just some extra information about the exam that I wanted you guys to know. Any questions about that? Good? Okay. Let's start with a rhetorical framework. Before I have us do some practice, did you guys have any questions about this diagram?
I was confused kind of what exigence means. I know we talked about that earlier in the year, but I need a refresher.
Sure. So exigence is kind of the occasion. It's what caused the author to put pen to paper or to open his mouth to speak. Sometimes that exigence is kind of like, just things that are going on in general in the world. But sometimes we have a very clear, direct cause that is leading the author to write. And that will usually come directly from the prompt. You'll know if there is exigence or not. Does that help?
What is
Yes.
Kairos?
Yeah, Kairos is, I'm not exactly sure why it's on here. This is not my diagram. But Kairos is kind of like the interplay between ethos, logos, and pathos. It's the proper thing at the proper time. So it's the interplay of all of these elements that are used in just such a way that they perfectly address what the audience needs to hear in order to accomplish the purpose that the author wants to accomplish, given the exigence of the situation. That's what Kairos is. I'm not really sure why it's listed separately, but that's what it is.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, cool. So as I mentioned, and let me see if I can share my screen here. I'm going to get back to my rhetorical framework. As I mentioned in the morning message, I think it's useful when you have this toolbox to consider starting at the top and asking yourself which of these tools is going to be most helpful in prying open this black box of a text that I've been given and seeing how it ticks. Because some of these tools are just not going to be as useful for some passages as others will be. And I like to start at the top. We're going to practice that for the Inquisitor passage first, and then we'll go from there to see some other passages and to see which tools we want to use in which situations. So let me ask you this. For the Inquisitor passage, do you think rhetorical situation is going to be helpful in understanding the passage and the rhetoric of the passage?
Could you clarify what you mean by that?
So, yeah, I mean, if we look at this passage, will understanding who the audience is or the exigence is, what the exigence is, will that help us to understand what the author is doing rhetorically, or not
I,
really?
I think it will.
Why do you say that?
Well, I think from the perspective of like the context and the fact that he's supposedly in a trial room and he has this challenge because he doesn't actually have a case or evidence to prove his case, and he even admits that, and that transforms. That's the reason behind the inspiration, so to speak, for how he makes his argument.
Right. And we know that, right? Because the
Mhm.
prompt tells us pretty clearly exactly what the exigence is. It's not like that abortion article we read where it's kind of like there are some vague things going on in the US, but this could have been written 3 years ago, or it could have been written 2 years from now. I mean, it could have been written in a lot of times. This particular passage, it's very clear that it was written for a very specific situation, for a very specific audience. Um, by the way, what do we know about that audience?
I've read that they were French, but that they were also supporters of the English, and
Mm-hmm.
they are very religious
Mm-hmm.
because they're members of the church.
Right. So when we think about audience, we always want to think about their needs and their assumptions. Um, what sort of needs do you think that they need to have met in order to convict Joan? That's one of the questions that we need to ask. And because we know who they are, we can answer that question. I mean, so if you're thinking about sort of religious people, even if we don't know them specifically by name, Bob, if we think general religious people, what are they going to need from their author, from their speaker, in order to convict Joan?
Evidence.
Yeah, well, and of course, like you would think anybody would need evidence to convict Joan, but um, what uh, and Zach, I think, will argue that they don't get much evidence, do they?
Mhm.
So what else do they need? If they can't really have evidence, what else are they going to need to convict Joan?
They need to feel justified kind of in the eyes of God.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And some of that you can infer from just thinking about, like, if you're a religious person, you don't want to kill somebody unless you can feel justified in the eyes of God. And some of it you can pick up from the passage itself and what the author, what the speaker, the inquisitor is doing for his audience. He is trying to make them feel justified. And so we can see that that's one of their needs. We can see that he's speaking very clearly to the audience in that respect. We could also think about the assumptions that they have, which we're not going to go into too much, but those are some considerations that will help us to understand the text. And so you can see how a rhetorical situation is going to be really important here.
And if I could add one thing to that too, I think he also kind of develops their needs for them, because if anyone came in and they feel like it's a court case, he kind of subverts the whole trial to you need to be right religiously and protect the church.
Yeah, and that reminds me of some of the debates we've had where the most successful team is the one that defines the parameters under which we're arguing. And he does that. He says, this isn't really about proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that she's evil, because you're not going to see that she's evil. On the surface, she's going to look quite innocent. This is about protecting the church from this monstrous horror, he says. Which brings us to the appeals. So if we kind of like move down the rhetorical framework a little bit, we see that there's the take-home idea, the assumptions and evidence, and that's directly linked to logos. But then we get the appeals, which I think are the next big piece to understanding this text. Which of the appeals do you think he uses most? Is he most concerned with establishing himself as a person who ... Is he most concerned with logos and rationale, or is he most concerned with drawing out particular emotions, or a mix?
I think it's definitely a lot of pathos.
Yeah, what emotion is he striving for?
Maybe a fear and then duty to
Mm-hmm.
protect from it.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe that sense of justification, or maybe a little bit of pride. We are compassionate people. We are protecting the church. So definitely pathos. What else?
I think he kind of fakes a lot of logos. Like he pretends to put out these logical arguments, but they don't hold, especially for a court trial.
Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned in your timed writing, and I had this in my notes too, that there's a bit of a slippery slope argument here, which is not the best type of logic, as we know. And certainly, proof and logic are two different things. He doesn't have any proof that she's
Mhm.
guilty, none at all. But he does have some logic. The question is whether it's kind of twisted logic. You know, this idea that it's because she looks so innocent that we have to convict her. That's a little bit strange, but I mean, his point is because she looks so innocent, she will drag a bunch of other people into this heresy. So that's definitely part of this. There's a theme. When you get to logos, you can kind of get to like what sort of themes are we getting at. He's got this theme of outer innocence and piety versus inner pride, inner diabolicalism, that sort of thing. The other thing we might want to look at for logos, and this is tied up with ethos a little bit. Towards the end of the passage, you'll notice him saying things like, the English want to say that she's got all this wantonness, but that's not quite right. So how would we articulate what he's doing in that moment? Anybody? Anybody? Is that too tough of a question?
Oh, I just found the point you were referring to.
Sure.
So could you re-ask the question?
So he says, the English want to claim that she's, full of all of this wantonness, but that's not actually true. How would we articulate what he's doing there logically?
I think, well, from what I'm reading, he was saying that the English testified she doesn't have that. And I think it it's almost as if he's just saying it to try and shoot down their credibility, but without any reason to believe him.
For I must tell you, gentlemen, that the things said of her by our English friends are supported by no evidence, whilst there is abundant testimony that her excesses have been excesses of religion and charity, and not of worldliness and wantonness. I think what we'd say here is that he is making a concession, but then he's qualifying. And you might say that he's doing that for two different reasons. On a logical ground, he is trying to kind of get at the nuances of his argument against her. But you also might say that it strengthens his credibility, his ethos. He's not completely saying that she is completely evil, that she's done all these terrible things, that all these rumors about her are completely true. He's saying, no, you can't believe everything you've heard, but what you can believe is that she will destroy the church. So that qualifying of the argument helps to strengthen his own logic, but also his ethos. And the last point of this of these appeals, he does have that ethos of credibility. He says, "I have seen this before," and he says it's no joke. This is really important. If you had seen what I've seen, you would realize just how important this is. And so he's got that credibility, and that reinforces the fear, of course, too. So we can see how a rhetorical situation and the appeals are both going to get us into the text a little bit. They're going to help us to understand what's going on. Now let me back up for a second and say that when you're this is kind of a way of thinking through the analysis before you do it. I still recommend that you chunk passages, because when you chunk passages, you see the hinge points. You see how things are going. And when we get to arrangement in a second, you'll see why that's important. You start to see little pieces. And if you only do this part where you kind of like think through the broad pieces, you might miss the little pieces that do create quite a bit of meaning. And to get the higher scores, you got to get the little pieces. So you can either start with a rhetorical framework and kind of think through the big issues, or you can start by chunking and then pull out the rhetorical framework as you go. It really kind of depends on which strategy works better for you in terms of thinking through a passage before you start writing. Any questions so far?
So for this passage, you would suggest that we chunk each, and actually, is there any way we could go over each chunk? Because I'm still a little confused about where the chunks are, because I don't know, I'm just really bad at that.
Well, really bad at it. I mean, this is very early in the year. We just started chunking, so I don't expect you to be super good at it yet. This is something we're practicing, so don't worry too much about that. But yeah, we can definitely go over the chunks. And the thing about chunking is that uh, there are no divisions here. I mean, he didn't speak this speech in a way that he made it clear where the breaks are. So you kind of have to decide where you think there's some shifts, and where you think that the function of things is switching a little bit. If I were gonna chunk this, let's see. I would maybe do it, and if I'm going to try not to do too many chunks, I might make my first one at line 27. So in the first part, you get this introduction to how heresy begins and just how serious it is. So you see that I've already kind of like put two smaller chunks together, because what heresy is and how it begins, that's one chunk. What it leads to and just how serious it is, that's maybe another chunk, but I think you can put those together, because otherwise you just have too much to talk about. Then in line 27, heresy at first seems innocent and even laudable. We get a little bit more about what it ends up in, but we also get sort of some greater depth into how this can spell the end of the church, and that and kind of the issue of appearance versus inner sin. And then I might put my next chunk at 42. You are all, I hope, merciful men. How else could you have devoted your lives to the service of our gentle Savior? Because at that point, I think that he starts to appeal to what they need to hear in order to convict her without feeling too guilty about it. And she starts to kind of acknowledge, like, you're gonna see somebody who looks great, but you still gotta convict her of heresy, otherwise we're gonna have trouble. And then I might do one further chunk, and you know, again, like, this is kind of an art, not a science. So there are other ways that you could chunk the passage. This is how I would do it, but you could certainly chunk a line or two here or there, especially because there's no paragraph breaks. I think the chunking here is very much up to you and how you want to divide the passage. I might do one more, line 59 or 60. Therefore be on your guard, or God forbid that I should tell you to harden your hearts. But this is kind of his conclusion. If you hate cruelty, he kind of turns the whole cruelty issue on its head. If you hate cruelty, you have to be cruel, because otherwise cruelty happens back to us. That sort of thing. Does that help, Elizabeth?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So speaking of chunking, I said in the morning message that arrangement, organization, structure, form are oftentimes really important when you get a logos-driven passage. So in this passage, after you have chunked a little bit, you might look at that. It's not super important to the text here. Like, I don't think that that's the best tool for understanding what's going on, because there are so many other big considerations. But you might look that he starts out with cause and effect, that he moves into some comparison and contrast, and that this becomes slightly more important as he delves deeper into the nature of her heresy. He's kind of comparing, like, what you expect to see versus what you do see. You could talk about that in terms of the passage, but again, I just don't think arrangement is the best way to get into this particular passage. And then finally, you've got the style surface features, and those are always at the behest of the more major considerations. But of course, as you're glancing through the passage, you might notice some pretty obvious style considerations that you know that you're going to want to talk about because they inform pathos so much. So you tell me which of these kind of like smaller features on the rhetorical framework did you notice?
I think there was a lot of kind of management of meaning, but I'm not sure I'm thinking of it the same way that it was that they're thinking of it.
Well, we haven't covered schemes and tropes yet, so this is a tough one for you to look at because schemes and tropes are things like, everything from like repetition to alliteration to uh, ascendetons, things like that, things we just haven't talked about yet. But I think if we look at this list, we'd see a lot of importance of diction, how he characterizes things, how he invokes that fear is based on diction, and tone. There's a little bit of illusion and a lot of imagery. So those ones are the ones that pop out at me. All right. I think we're ready to move on to a different passage if you guys are feeling okay with this one.
Mhm. What's the difference between illusion and imagery?
So an allusion with an A is a reference to a historical, literary, I guess those are pretty historical or literary happening or story that pulls in all of the meaning that came with it to whatever you're looking at. So so if while an author is writing, I don't want to give away anyone's we're going to talk about this year, but he references something from Homer's The Odyssey, then all of the sense of like what happened in that other story gets brought into your text, and that's what an allusion is. Imagery doesn't necessarily have to refer to anything in particular. Make sense?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
All right, let's do case against perfection. So we talked about this one quite a bit. What do you think in terms of rhetorical situation? Is that going to be a useful tool or not so useful?
I don't see a lot of that coming up, except the second half, the assumptions and evidence part.
Yeah, so certainly, and that's a lot more related to the main idea or the argument. Yeah, certainly we talked a lot about warrants and evidence, and I think that that's really important. But in terms of exigence, audience, and purpose, those don't seem to be very useful tools for case against perfection because we don't really have a sense of who the specific audience is. We don't have a real clear sense of the exigence. And the purpose seems pretty much the same as the argument. They're kind of closely aligned. So I don't think that that's terribly useful for talking about this text. In terms of the appeals, do you think it's mostly ethos, logos, or pathos?
Logos.
And this is why when I asked you to write a rhetorical analysis thesis statement, you were probably like, well, what am I supposed to say? Like, he uses evidence, he uses science. Like, what am I supposed to say about this? Because it's such a logos driven text, it's hard to know how to analyze it. And this is what I think is most important about this toolbox that I've given you, is that it helps you to see that organization, structure, form, arrangement are really useful for talking about texts that otherwise don't seem to have a lot going on. Because when you read Case Against Perfection, you might look for all these surface features and you might think, well, I mean, there's a little bit of, there's that allusion to Prometheus, but other than that, like, there's not a lot of metaphors or similes or crazy diction or whatever. So again, what am I supposed to say? But the arrangement can be really helpful in helping us figure out what to say about it. And the thing about arrangement is that you might feel like you're summarizing, but you're not. You're saying something that requires some sophisticated analysis, because picking out a pattern of the method of development or the modes of discourse is actually pretty tough to do. And it does inform the argument. One of the things that makes Case Against Perfection kind of strange, but also kind of interesting, is that he doesn't say his point until like page 6 or 10. He doesn't fully say it until page 10. He doesn't at all like reference it until page 6. And we talked about that at the beginning about what he was doing beforehand. So broad view speaking, if we're talking about the arrangement, we're thinking about how he's exploring possible arguments, but then he's dismissing them. And then he's carefully recalibrating to get to his actual point. That's the broad view. And we've talked about that too. But let's look, if you've got Case Against Perfection, you can pull it up. I want to look at page 2 of it. Let's see. I'll put it on my screen as well. In just a second. Here we go. Okay. So here's page 2. We're looking at this muscles situation. And we're trying to figure out kind of on a sentence by sentence, or maybe not quite that small, but in little pieces, what is his pattern of developing his argument, of exploring his argument? What's the arrangement here? So he starts out, everyone would welcome a gene therapy that did something or other, but what if that same therapy were used to improve athletic performance? Researchers have developed a synthetic gene that blah, 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 blah. Then he goes into the next paragraph. Suppose for the sake of arguments that we could do it like this. But wouldn't that be kind of weird? What exactly is troubling about it? It might be argued that, this is this third paragraph, it might be argued that this is the problem. But the fairness argument against enhancement has a fatal flaw. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, this is a very typical progression that he uses in this text. What do we see here? What is he moving through? Like, what is his pattern here? Can anyone help me out with that?
Just a counter argument and then a response.
Yep, but I think we can go even more in depth than that. I think we can be even more nuanced in how we're describing it.
One way I think I saw you describing in the morning message was that he's introducing bad arguments for his side to make himself stand out as looking better and more understanding and balanced.
Certainly. But again, I think if we're looking at arrangement, and obviously Case Against Perfection is really long, so you would never have it on a timed writing, or even I would never give you an analysis that was quite that long. But if we were just looking at these 3 paragraphs, what would we say about the arrangement? He starts out by showing us the state of science at present. Then he moves into the questions that are surrounding that state of science. Then he moves to the statement of the commonly accepted argument about that science and about why that's troubling to us. And then finally he ends up with the counter to that argument. He says, but that's not the full story. And that's kind of his MO throughout the whole passage. He starts with the science, he asks some questions, he says, here's why people are asking those questions, but that's not the whole full story. Later on in page 6, if we looked at page 6, we would see a lot of, some might say, but. So he's continuing to ask questions throughout the whole thing to hone his point and to get down to the clearest articulation of what he means by giftedness and solidarity and responsibility and why those play such a huge role in the controversy surrounding enhancements. So arrangement can be that nitpicky. if you want it to be. If you've got nothing else to say about a passage and you're trying to figure out what to say about the logos, you can look at, what is his pattern of exploring this topic. Make sense?
Mhm.
Okay. Finally, we get to Fridman. So let me pull up Fridman for us again. And we've looked at Fridman quite a bit. Here we go. How about rhetorical situation? Important? Exigence, audience, purpose?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, it's not going to be very useful. I mean, if you had to, you could describe the exigence, you could describe the audience, but that's just not going to give us the most bang for our buck. What about appeals?
There's a lot of pathos with a little logos
Yeah,
mixed
I
in.
was going to say path.
Mm-hmm. Yes, although, it's interesting to me, this afternoon's group was quick to dismiss the logos as not very important as well. There's certainly some pathos, but there is quite a bit of logos here, in terms of, and remember, logos doesn't have to be quotes or studies or facts. It can be rationale. It can be reasons for things. It can be well thought out lines of reasoning that support your point. So we had talked about some of the pathos in here. But there isn't a ton of like weighted language. There's not like heavy language that like leads us to particular emotions. Instead, a lot of what we get are just I mean, there, and certainly there's like the patriotic angle, but there's a lot of reasons, the rationale for why we need to value nerds. So again, I think that if we looked at this in terms of arrangement, we would have quite a bit to say about how he's developing his argument. So, and we kind of did this a little bit on a worksheet when we first looked at the text, but if you look up here, he starts out with definition. Why does he start out with definition? He uses that definition to draw out the ridiculousness of how we view nerds. And then he goes into, starting in line 11, he starts to go to illustration. It's not narrative because he's not necessarily telling a story, but he's describing or illustrating what it's like to be a nerd. And then line 28, he has this very concise enough is enough, which communicates a certain tone, which I think is important to talk about. But that's a hinge point. So if you're talking about chunking, I think that's a good place to chunk the passage right there. And this is where he starts getting into a comparison and contrast and kind of a cause and effect. You could label it either way, where he talks about, what is going to happen to our country in comparison to other countries if we do not value our smart kids. And he does that that exploration through some rhetorical questions at the end, and through some further illustration. But you see how I've managed to talk about the strategies that our author has undertaken simply by looking at the mode of development or method development, the mode of discourse. And then, of course, within those sections, I'm going to talk about the weighted language where there is some. I'm going to talk about the syntax. I'm going to talk about the pathos, things like that. Any questions here?
No.
Okay. So my hope is that you feel empowered to use, because the problem is like we talk about all these different rhetorical tools as the year starts, and it's kind of like, well, what am I supposed to look at ethos, logos, pathos, or am I supposed to soapstone? Like, which am I supposed to do? Well, you're supposed to do any that work. And this diagram kind of helps you to see that there's like a ton of tools at your fingertips, and you really can choose any which one that you think will really break apart that text for you and allow you to peer inside and see what the argument is and what sort of things are feeding into that argument and building the argument up and making the argument go one direction or another. So that's my hope. Any further questions before I let you go for the evening?
This is just a general like formatting question for essays.
Sure.
Do you how many paragraphs do you suggest our essays should be for the RA?
I don't know the answer to that question. I do tend to think that the longer essays are probably more successful. That's not always true. I mean, it's not about length, but if you can, I mean, so the answer is, as my friend would say, Lincoln's legs. It needs to be as long as it needs to be. In the sense that if you have 4 chunks that you want to cover, you should probably have 5 paragraphs. But it doesn't need to be a 5-paragraph essay in the sense that, introduction, 3 points, and a conclusion. Nobody believes in that. In fact, AP readers get really annoyed when students are clearly trying to fulfill some sort of weird 5-paragraph essay requirement in their brains. What they want from you is to get through the full passage. And I don't think that there's a really good answer to how many paragraphs that will take, unfortunately. It sort of depends on the text. Sorry.
Okay. No, you're fine. Thank you. And is a conclusion necessary for these?
I tend to think no, if you've covered the entire passage. I will say that if you're feeling like you want to have a conclusion, I would suggest taking the last little bit of the text and using that to kind of like wrap things up. So taking something from the end that you think kind of like pulls everything together anyway and using that to pull together your own thoughts. But I would rather that you didn't have a conclusion than that you had some sort of clunky paragraph where you're like, in conclusion, here are the 3 elements that I mentioned in my thesis statement, which you could just read again, Mrs. Fulmer. I'm like, okay, why did you tell me that? That wasted like 2 minutes of your time. Don't waste 2 minutes of your time. Instead, say something that is like from the passage that kind of concludes, or just allow your work to speak for itself.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I have 2 questions kind of branching off of that. The first is because I know you kind of just read my essay.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, I made a couple formatting choices I wasn't sure about. So first, my first 2 paragraphs after my introduction were kind of on the same idea of a chunk, but I broke it up because I think I saw a little bit of a difference. Did you notice anything with that being odd?
Let me look back at that. Elizabeth, if you don't have any further questions, you're welcome to, since this is not your essay we're looking at.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. In fact, I'm going to stop the recording, Zach, and then I'll answer your question, okay?
Okay.